Mickey Huff. Welcome back to the program.
It's always an honor to be on here with you, RJ. You do some really stellar work, and it's just great to sit down and have a conversation with you about the state of our so-called free press. We have a lot of work to do. It's been a long time coming, the decline in public trust of the so-called Fourth Estate. And here we are facing down an administration Trump 2.0. Let's not forget that his first stint in office, he weaponized the phrase fake news and talked about the press as being the enemy of the people. So we're in for a pretty wild ride here, RJ, and we're going to really need a lot of vibrant, intrepid, independent journalists really trying to keep tabs and report and hold these folks in power to account.
And of course, we've already seen the kowtowing by corporate owners of newspapers and other outlets, the genuflecting, including the Washington Post cartoonist literally doing a cartoon of Jeff Bezos, owner of the Washington Post, among other things, and others genuflecting, including Mickey Mouse, representing the Disney Corporation, genuflecting to the incoming president, for which was censored. So she, to her credit, she left her position rather than accept that. And I'm afraid more of us in the journalism profession will have to do that kind of thing as censorship accelerates. So let's start with this. You mentioned public trust and public confidence. You cite, you and your co-author of the introduction or overview section of State of the Free Press 2025, you cite two, maybe three, but I'm thinking of two statistics that are especially striking when they're conjoined, the way you guys did. One is the ranking of the United States in freedom of the press, which has dropped significantly. Never great, never what it should have been for a country that likes to call itself we're number one. We haven't been close to number one for a long time, but it's dropping. And at the same time, public trust in the media is dropping. And yet, we hear a lot of complaints from our colleagues in the media about, especially mainstream media, about wondering why people don't trust the media more. Well, it's a matter of degree. Fake news may have been weaponized against factual information, but there's a lot, I can't say bullshit. There's a lot of bullshit out there. I'll just have to edit it out.
You said it.
And in the mainstream media as well as, the right-wing media sphere. And so let's start with this. I mean, I would argue that fake news would not, as Democrats define it, let's say, which is the right-wing media sphere, would not be so successful if there weren't an overall authenticity or truth problem, credibility problem, number one. And number two, that includes casting a skeptical eye everywhere in the corporate media, because they're all dependent on making profits for their owners and keeping their owners politically secure, as we've seen with this genuflection toward Trump. But I mean, that's my thesis anyway. That's what I took away from that very first conjoining of two statistics. What do you think?
Yeah, well, RJ, so much there to unpack and talk about. And again, I'm honored to have the opportunity to do that with you. The U.S., by last count, I believe it was 54th, which was, or in the 50s. It was a pretty significant drop of, I believe, 9 places, perhaps, on the Press Freedom Index. By the way, Israel's not far from that status as well, openly censoring Al Jazeera and much of what's been happening in Gaza the past year. But the conjoining, I think, is where it's again the connecting of the dots, something that if corporate media reporters would connect more dots in a historically contextual way, they may be able to actually reverse the trend of the lack of public trust. I mean, you're talking about an integrity problem here. And we just saw it writ large at the Washington Post, even though the editorial page editor, David Shipley, said that, that they didn't censor the cartoon because of the content. It was because they already had They had already addressed some issue about it and it was redundant or something. But again, what echo chamber this person must be living in the Beltway there, to not understand how these oligarchs have been lining up, genuflecting to kiss the ring of the Trump 2.0, behind Musk on these coattails. Now Zuckerberg at Meta saying they're going to drop fact checking, which by the way was always a problem.
Right,
We can
right.
get into that later, but the trend is clear, right? We see even more people in big tech throwing money at the inauguration that wouldn't even do it for the Biden administration. We see more kowtowing to the Trump administration in the corporate media. MSNBC has basically tanked in its ratings. The whole team blue approach to media of pretending that everything is just going along fine and they can just run their whatever candidate they choose. Let's not forget that in the 2016 election, RJ, the Democrats illegally argued in court that they could choose their candidate in back rooms smoking cigars, Tammany Hall style, because there were no laws preventing it. This is a party that has lost really total connection with rank and file Americans in many ways. And this is the reason too that we see in the elite media, the corporate media. I mean, Fox literally lies through its teeth and has to pay nearly billion-dollar settlements for it. So it's not like we're letting them off the hook. But the media haven't really tapped into issues that the public really cares about. Look what happened recently with the killing of the healthcare CEO. I mean, a majority of Americans came out almost gruesomely celebrating it, for lack of a better phrase. But that again, that shows us that there is extraordinary perception gaps, right? The American public has certain ways that they're viewing what's happening that often is based on harsh economic realities, whereas the Democratic establishment and the corporate media, they just want to keep, kind of like it's that meme where you have the picture of the big horn that's placed over someone's head and just blasting it at them, whether they want it or not. And I just don't think that they've really learned any lessons about what's been going on in this country and what's been driving this country, unfortunately, further to the right, with such great irony, because the solutions for many of the challenges and things we face are not going to be solved by the oligarchy that's created it. It's not going to be solved by a con man, grifter, and convicted felon coming in for a separate term who has great hostility towards journalists and the press in general. But, we're left with very few alternatives in our political system, RJ, because we've spent the last 50 years getting rid of it grassroots programs and having the Democrats become more and more right center, more and more based on the support of Silicon Valley and oligarchic money and corporate money. So let's unpack the one thing that you said, and I'd love to hear your views on this too. You talked about again, we're declining in press freedom status worldwide. We also have this massive credibility gap, and now the fourth estate is polling at less favorability and less trustworthy ratings than Congress. I mean, that's pretty
Right.
riveting, right? Given the negativity that many Americans have towards Congress, the Supreme Court in general. Um, what does that tell us? Well, it's interesting, RJ. I was interviewed by the New York Times, believe it or not. I'm glad you were sitting down. I was contacted by the New York Times a few months ago. And it's the first time they've really covered anything that we've done at Project Censored since our inception 49 years ago, to my knowledge. Curiously, the subject was this was a correspondent based in Europe covering the not Davos, I'm sorry, the Athena, the Democracy Forum in Athens. Sorry. And one of the themes of it was declining public trust in institutional journalism. Lo and behold,
Right.
it's as if the media started to find out that people weren't believing it anymore. And so they kind of went out and said, let's talk to some people about that. And somehow I got on the short list for that. So, which was great. It was a great opportunity. But let me just very, very briefly explain to you what happened, in all respect to the reporter who reached out and did this story. But they were just flabbergasted by what I had to say, which basically was just like, look, have you held up a mirror? Have you read your paper? Have you really talked to people in the general public about any of the things that you report about regularly? And then, of course, one of the elephants in the room has been Gaza, where the New York
Oh, of
Times has been
course.
winning Pulitzer Prizes while they're simultaneously publishing bogus stories about rape, Their editorial staff is telling people not to use certain terms, not to talk about genocide, not to talk about perspectives coming out of Gaza. And again, when I would bring these things up as an issue that has resulted in declining public trust because they see the gap between the things Americans are actually seeing or what they would see on social media. They're like, hey, on social media, it shows these people are dying in droves. Why is this not being covered somewhere? Their response was like, well, I can't really report that. I can't really report that in my story. So the question was, why is there declining public trust? My answer was because you're not covering issues accurately that are in the public interest. And they said back to me, well, I can't really report that.
Right.
What do you do with that, RJ?
Well, it's that it's fascinating, actually, Mickey, and I'm really glad you brought it up because to me, it's partially corporate, and people say, well, nobody censors me. No, they don't have to because they select for people who are going to go along with certain rules.
They
But
were doing the job for the censor. They knew what they could and
pre-censoring,
couldn't do.
yeah, it's very rare that the corporate sponsors have to call up and because they know what they need to do to get ahead, right? So
Yeah.
it's that plus it's a cultural thing. And I really think,
Yeah.
40, 50 years ago, there was the culture of, the crusading reporter out to get the truth. And I mean, there was a lot of BS in the media then too, but that was the ideal, was the truth. And you did what you did for the truth. And let's face it, reporters were not the best paid. They were the ink-stained wretches who came up as copy boys or copy girls, and finally, got into the newsroom. But now it is a kind of elite tribalism if you're at a place like the New York Times, where you've gone to a fine school, Ivy League school, and you're comfortable with these people. To use Gore Vidal's phrase, it's not just a conspiracy; it's a conspiracy of shared values. That's my take on it. What do you think?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Interesting you bring up Vidal too. I'm always reminded by his very pithy phrase that we live in the United States of amnesia.
Right,
Right? We don't even remember we had a vibrant press some 50 years
right,
ago, and a lot of competition and a lot of local media where we now live in news deserts. I mean, part of what I'm doing at the Park Center is honoring the legacy of the late great IF Izzy Stone,
yes,
right? We do the Izzy Awards every spring, started by Jeff Cohen there and continued by Raza Rumi. It'll be our 17th celebration of Izzy Stone coming up this April. But even then, you take a look at George Seldes, Izzy Stone. Those folks often had to go outside the establishment press to report what they were doing. I.F. Stone
right.
did it for over 20 years with the
But he
I.F. Stone
printed his
Weekly.
own newsletter. Yeah,
Yeah, he had to go outside of the system to critique
right.
it, right? And there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of interesting analogies we can draw from that relate to what you were just saying. It's very difficult, and this is now riffing off of another muckraker, Upton Sinclair, going back 100 years. When Upton Sinclair ran for governor of California in 1934, he was complaining in some way about the press coverage and the anti-socialism and so forth, even during the New Deal period, right? He was a socialist candidate. But he said, it's difficult to get someone to understand something whose job it is to not understand it.
Right,
And
right.
I was
Exactly.
paraphrasing and avoiding the sexist language that he employed at the time. But you get the drift here is that, like, a lot of the folks that are in the corporate media, the so-called mainstream, they're like the fish in the water that's unaware of what they don't talk about the water, but they rely on the water to exist, right? So they know what to ask and not ask if they want to keep their jobs, but then they also bemoan simultaneously that they can't always do what they need to do, but they have to keep their jobs. It's a catch-22, right? But this is why independent media is so important. This is why at Project Censored every year and in our book again this year, we highlight what we think are the top stories coming out of the independent press that the corporate media either couldn't be bothered with, maybe didn't address at all, or if they did cover it, they did so in a partial way that amounts to what we call news abuse, or the new technical term for it is malinformation. Misinformation is unintentional, making mistakes. And we're all human. We
Right.
all make mistakes. That's why
Right.
there's retractions. That's why there's corrections. We don't expect people to
Right.
always get things right the first time. We get that. But misinformation that's left unaddressed is a significant problem that leads to lack of trust. We're back to that.
Right.
Disinformation is purposefully putting out false or misleading information, which leads to declining trust. Malinformation is information that appears on the surface to be factually accurate, but is framed in such a way that it excludes important historical background information or other relevant perspectives that lead the public to potentially come to a certain conclusion, even though that conclusion would be undermined if further information that is known would have been reported, right? All of those things contribute to what, RJ? Lack of public trust in journalism. They contribute to a less well-informed electorate, and they now are helping produce what the media is calling the low-informed voter. Well, where did that come from, RJ? Where have
Right.
you gotten?
Right.
We've
And
had us on the show. Go ahead, go ahead, go ahead.
let me riff on that a little bit, if I may,
Yeah.
Nikki, because it's so important. And you in the State of the Free Press 2025, you guys quote Ben Bagdikian
Oh yeah.
on the need for a functioning media, to have a functioning democracy. And the fact is that this kind of playing fast and loose malinformation, sometimes through omission, sometimes through lies of commission, it really has harmed democracy more than they can imagine. I'm thinking, for example, of our new and our once and future president, Mr. Trump. Uh, I'll give you one example that's disturbed me for a long time. Uh, he's been widely quoted on CNN and in a newspaper, major national newspapers, as having said after the Charlottesville, the racist rally there, he was widely quoted as saying there are good people on both sides. But he immediately, if you watch the clip, then went on to say, but not the white nationalists. I don't mean them. And now, it's still, you could criticize that statement a lot, and I would, but by leaving out the latter part, which it's easy enough for Fox News or anyone else to play the longer clip, then when media figures wonder why they haven't been more effective in communicating what's corrupt and debased and disgusting about Trump, well, that's one reason why, because you're overstating and I hate that they make me seem like I'm defending Trump, but
And you're not. You're defending the role of the free press to
right,
inform accurately the public and let the chips fall where they may.
right, and absolutely, and if you burn your own credibility, then then when you have a real story to tell, people won't listen.
There are so many right-wing attacks against the press. It's not hard to find them and to debunk them, right? So why the establishment press made conscious decisions to do these kind of things, just like they did, and Nolan Higdon and I wrote about this, and Let's Agree to Disagree, as well as the United States of Distraction. You might remember the young student from, I believe, a religious school or private school in Cincinnati with the MAGA hat that had the confrontation with the native person in the nation's capital, right? And the way that they
Right,
framed it, it was all the disrespectful MAGA youth having racist attacks against this person. And it turned, I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but in this instance, that's not what was happening at all.
right,
And the corporate media framed it exactly backwards and falsely. And what was happening, they led to their own sort of denigration of their own integrity in it. And they inadvertently boosted a political signal that is often racist
right,
and is often based on intolerance, right? So it's as if, they're shooting themselves in the foot, and it's very, very frustrating because the corporate media has this huge platform and this megaphone, right? And the independent press struggles to get these reports out and they struggle for attention. And even through social media, through shadow banning and so on, and so many, and algorithmic suppression and demonetization, there are so many challenges for public interest grassroots journalism. It's very painful to see the corporate media sort of willfully go into these things and act as if they're surprised with the outcome, like you mentioned over at Bezos' Washington Post, where they just got caught censoring a newspaper and then claiming it was news judgment for redundancy. You know what? I was just talking to my buddy Nolan Higdon on the Project Censored show about that very thing. And Nolan reminded me, because we wrote about this, he said, well, the Washington Post didn't have any problem running 15 or 16 stories about Bernie Sanders in 16 hours that were all negative. They didn't have any problem with redundancy then. But now they have a
Right.
problem with redundancy because they're now criticizing potentially the owner of the paper, the fealty being paid to an incoming oligarch, etc. I mean, really, it's enough to make one rip their hair out, actually. It's very frustrating. And look, let's go back to this, what I call sort of an aha moment when the mask really comes off before the 2016 election with then CEO Les Moonves of CBS, who
Right.
said at a big tech convention in San Francisco, sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Keep going. It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS, right?
Right.
That is stuck with me for now 9 almost years because it's somebody in the press that's telling the public that they don't care. They're
Right.
after eyeballs, advertisers, profits, and money. And even though this focal point is toxic, they're giving $6 billion of free coverage, double what they gave to Clinton, triple what they gave to Sanders in the 2016 election alone, only to turn back and then say, oh, we messed up. Democracy dies in darkness. And then that same newspaper that mea culpa is now censoring the very kind of criticism of the oligarchs that own the press that we need right now, whether it's Musk or people at the LA Times or Bezos himself or others. We need to be critical. Last year at the Censored book, the 2024 book, Andy and I took aim at the billionaire free press, right? As AJ Liebling quipped in the early 60s, a free press belongs to anyone who can own one. Well,
Right.
we've seen that model writ large, and the people then that own that press do not have the interests of the general public at heart. And again, I have to say it, democracy dies in darkness, especially when Jeff Bezos is turning out the lights, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. And, the Les Moonves comment is, I remember I was working for Bernie Sanders at the time. Bernie was consistently drawing much bigger crowds. Bernie was, if the press were anything even approaching its previous flawed incarnations, Bernie would have been the political story of the year, but because it was an incredible, I'm not speaking as a partisan, as a journalist, it was an amazing story.
Yeah.
But Donald Trump was easy, right? Because he was famous from The Apprentice, so and because he said crazy things that drew eyeballs. So what's the saying? He who rides the tiger cannot dismount. Now they're all, they created Trump in a sense,
They
and
did.
now they're beholden to him,
Well, look, and more to that, it's almost as if the more you keep repeating flagrant falsehoods and double down on them, it just doesn't even matter. The fact that so many people are migrating or flocking, to the incoming Trump administration is really I mean, it's an extraordinary display of sycophancy, the likes of which we haven't seen really for some time. And granted, this Biden administration has done a lot to earn the mistrust of the American public. They were meddling in social media, and now it makes it even easier for people like Zuckerberg to come out and say, "Well, I always thought that was the wrong approach." And then they go back to the notion that pretends that Musk is some kind of, hero of free expression, which is the most preposterous thing to say of all time. The guy is willy-nilly censoring people, deplatforming people,
right?
constantly canceling. They cancel far more people on the left end of the political dial than other places. And more so, they're just interested in suppressing anybody that like puts a sort of like a dent in their narcissistic armor. I mean, it's the things that go on and are being discussed in the political ecosystem right now are completely banal. They're dumbed down to such an extraordinary degree that we can't even have any kind of sober analysis of it. People like Musk are openly embracing fascist movements in Europe. I mean, they're openly embracing
Right.
far right neo-Nazi movements, and the press here is just like, He's a gadfly. He's a maverick.
Right,
Look at him go. He's a
right,
billionaire. That's
right.
amazing. What will he do next? Let's remember, the guy's never invented anything. He was born on third base, thought he hit a triple, was born in apartheid South Africa to, an emerald mine owner, an oligarch that has bought everything that he's ever had, and he's squandered even the money that he's had to create huge prevaricating machines over at X, former Twitter, that now people like Zuckerberg are saying we're going to make ourselves more like X and Twitter. And it's like, well, so you're going to generate more environments that are like media cesspools. So fair question, RJ. What do the establishment press do, given that that's now seen as the competition for the eyeballs, right? And I'm not saying all social media is bad. Part of the reason that they have the ban on TikTok was because that's where a younger generation of people were learning about the horrors of Gaza,
Right,
right?
absolutely. And, I think the answer for some in the mainstream media is only college graduates will watch TV news and read newspapers, and they're all centrist Democrats. So we'll woo them with the kind of coverage that floats their boat. And then the giant, even malinformation doesn't begin to describe it when you're talking about social media. It's really like the creation of individual mutant universes for every individual to just drive their lizard brains, crazy. And they're not just being misled; they're in individual hallucinations and algorithmic hallucinations. And where the hell, we've got to find how we nurture a real independent press, the kind where if you get a single fact wrong, you're depressed for 3 days because
Yeah.
you're that committed to the truth, and where you do an analysis, where you connect the threads, where get the matrix of forces outline that's affecting story A or story B. I know you have a section in State of the Free Press. You guys have a section about good projects that are going on, but I'm just not sure how we do that. It's a massive assignment.
It is a massive assignment, which is again why I'm, teaching journalism and teaching critical media literacy, hopefully to another generation of people that really care about the same kind of ethics and values that drove people like Izzy Stone, or that drove people like Ida Tarbell over 100 years, or Lincoln Steffens, or even Walter Cronkite, who was at CBS, right? There are examples in our history of people that really told stories that made a difference. Journalism does matter, but
Yes,
it needs to redefine itself as the ethical, transparently sourced vehicle to expose corruption and report the truth in a public in a way that leads to meaningful civic engagement. What you were describing on social media just moments ago, RJ, is more like it's more like this algorithmically created prison that is, siloed confirmation bias echo chambers, right? That are like dopamine hitting machines,
right,
right?
absolutely, yeah,
And it's been shown over and over, the social, the social science research on this is pretty clear. We've even had a surgeon general come out and say that there's a serious social media addiction problem in this country that is contributing to some of the other problems you and I are talking about right
right,
now.
right,
And we have so many of these multiple challenges that are now intertwined. The privatization of education, the collapse of critical pedagogy, the conglomeration of corporate for-profit media. Even if independent media is expanding and has new outlets, it's gate kept at so many different layers and levels that it atomizes us back into those siloed echo chambers where we only think we think we're talking amongst a large diverse group of people, but we're really only glad handing each other. We're not doing anybody favors by staying with our one, two, or three favorite media outlets. We really need to diversify and understand what messages are getting out to the rest of the public
right.
and what information the public should have ready access to be able to see more clearly what's actually going on around us. Let's remember, back to Seldies. He said the job of journalism isn't to both sides anything or to feign objectivity. It's to tell the public what's actually going on.
Right.
And that means you got to speak truth to power and speaking truth as power. And you got to call out the owners. We should have a vast, vibrant free press, public press in this country. Scholars like Victor Picard have pointed out that we could do this in an extraordinary way for $4 or $5 billion. We really need more like $30 billion to do it. Well, come on. Some of these oligarchs could just shave that off of money they didn't even know they had and donate it for some kind of cause like this, just like they could end poverty, just like they could end homelessness. But you know what the oligarchs aren't going to do? Any of that. And the
Right.
corporate media, instead of calling out one of the most obvious things, their conflicts of interest and their rank hypocrisy. You and I, before we got on here, we're talking about the late, great George Carlin, right? Let's not
Right.
have a double standard here. One standard will do just fine. Instead of doing that, they just kowtow to it because they're part of the profit-making machine, and journalism itself needs to be rescued from the industry that it has created around itself. It needs to go back to the grassroots, back to independent public interest journalism, and needs to be bottom up, not top down, needs to stop its rancor partisanship with corporate media, and it needs to truly start telling the public what's going on.
To which I extremely eloquently said, Mickey, and to which I can only add, we have to re-sacralize truth.
Yes.
You know, just if you're on MSNBC and you report that Robert Mueller is going to find this and that, and it doesn't happen, you should be miserable. You should,
You
offer
learn something
ritual
from it.
penance.
You should learn something.
Yeah, yeah, and you should say, guys, I got it wrong because I care about the truth and I want you to hear the truth. And until we do that, I think, it's going to be a million echo chambers.
I don't want to paraphrase Jack Nicholson from that movie with Tom Cruise, the "you can't handle the truth" part. But I really think the American public can handle the truth more than the corporate leadership of the Democratic Party, and certainly more than whomever is ingratiating themselves to the inner Trump circle, where JD Vance himself said, "Yeah, so what? We lied. So
Right.
what? That story about Haitian immigrants eating pets isn't isn't true. Big deal. We're calling attention to the media and why the media, it's the same old bait and switch, but why do the corporate media fall for it? Why do they tolerate it, RJ?
Why
Why do they
wasn't
pretend
that
that that didn't happen
why wasn't that JD Vance quote headlined in
over and
every
over and
paper in
over?
the United States? We'll tell a phony story if it advances our narrative. That should have been banner headline everywhere. And instead of saying,
Everywhere.
oh, you know how these guys are. Well, no, the public doesn't know how these guys are. You and I know, they know. A lot of voters don't know. Tell them.
Well, look, it's hard for the Democrats to run with that. We tell false stories because we can get away with it. Because Rachel Maddow and MSNBC made a whole cottage industry of Russiagate. I mean, they
Which
made
I
a whole.
described as a classic moral panic. Quoting
Yeah, 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 yeah.
the
I'm not
sociologist
saying
Stanley
Putin's.
Cohen. It had
I'm not
moral
saying
panics have.
absolutely.
I think Cohen called them moral entrepreneurs, moral impresarios who generate these false stories out of self-interest. It was a
Yeah,
classic example of it. Oh, they're tampering with the control systems for nuclear power plants, and they're changing.
not true. Yeah. All bogus.
Yeah,
Nolan and I wrote whole articles about this. One of them on Counterpunch is called "From Russiagate with Love." So
that's a good
if you if
title.
you want to look at just even a listing of these things, not to mention Jeff Girth at the Columbia Journalism
Oh yeah.
Review did a great expose taking down some of this nonsense. Yochai Benkler at Harvard with network propaganda. I'm not saying Russia doesn't meddle. I'm not saying
No.
Putin is good. Do we really have to live in a clown car world where we can't have deep adult conversations in the gray zone? But that we have our own corporate media is the biggest propaganda machine, and the social media, anti-social media, big tech Silicon Valley is the biggest propaganda machine the world has ever seen. If other groups can come and nefariously utilize that to their advantage, who's to blame exactly, RJ? And
Right.
by the way, if we didn't have a failing education system on purpose that taught people how to think critically, not told them what to think to a test, we wouldn't be in half of this mess. Now, would we? This is again back to why we need to reclaim education in the public interest. We need to have journalism in the public interest, and we need to lionize as much as possible truth-telling, independent journalist outlets that tell us what we need to know, not just what's popular to say.
Yeah, amen. And when it comes to education, John Dewey might have a thing or two to say about the situation today too.
Hey, versus Lippmann, that was a classic argument where Lippmann was siding with Eddie Bernays about manufacturing consent, and Dewey was like, "I don't think that's a good idea."
Right, Dewey versus Lippmann. Yeah, that's a great story.
Classic,
I've
yep.
thought about a lot over the years. Tell the truth or manage what Walter Lippmann called, you'll remember this, the bewildered herd.
Yeah.
That's how he described the electorate. The
And back to
bewildered herd.
Seldes, tell the truth and run.
Well, on that note, Mickey Huff, director of Project Censored and so much more, thanks for all the great work you do, and thanks for your work on this new book. Again, the book is State of the Free Press or State of the Press? I'm blanking.
State of the Free Press 2025. You can learn more at projectcensored.org.
All right, my friend. Well, thanks as always. Good to talk to you.
Back at you, man. Always an honor, RJ. Thanks so much.
We depend on your support here at the 0 Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.